Welcome to Grimm Realities. Today we're going to talk about Agile, SCRUM. What do you call it? Do you call it SCRUM? Do you call it Agile? Let's say you've started your career as a software engineer and you keep seeing that on job postings, people want you to have experience in an Agile environment, or they want you to have experience working with Scrum or as a Scrum Master. Let's talk about what it is, and then I'm going to burst some bubbles.
Hi, this is Grimm. Welcome to Grimm Realities.
Agile sounds great, doesn't it? Just the word itself. It sounds like you're going to be quick and nimble on your feet. Man, I remember back in 2011-ish when Agile was really bursting onto the software development scene. I was very interested in the idea. I wanted to experiment with it and kind of learn the methodology. Because the reality is, creating software is hard. It's hard to choose priorities. It's hard to know what to work on when. In the real world, priorities often shift at a moment's notice. Somebody gets a great idea, maybe a terrible idea they think is great, doesn't really matter, and you are now tasked with implementing it on some deadline that is completely unreasonable. That's the reality of software engineering. The point with Agile is that you're supposed to break down tasks into manageable, bite-sized chunks that a development team or a single engineer can do in, let's say, a span of 2 weeks. So that would be your sprint. And you're going to have meetings where you get ready for the sprint and you make sure everybody knows what they're working on. And then at the end of the sprint, you look at whether you achieved what you set out to achieve. If not, what went wrong, what can be improved for the next sprint. The whole point is that you're going through an iterative process of development that continually moves you forward. And this was the idea behind Agile and the Scrum process in general. I'm going to tell you about the reality of it. The idea is that you spend half of the time meeting and twice the amount of time actually getting stuff done, actually programming if you're a software engineer. That's the idea behind Agile, is that you're boiling things down into kind of bite-sized tasks that you can actually say, did I get this done or not? Well, how does reality line up with that? Well, first off, there's a couple of problems that come into play when you actually implement this in the real world. One of the things is a lot of software development cannot be boiled down into bite-sized chunks. Oftentimes, you have to build complex systems that require a ton of work that no matter what you do, you cannot plan out to such an extent where you can actually say, oh yeah, it's just a series of these little things we have to do. First off, you have to look into the mindset of the person that thinks you can actually do that. Now, if you look back on any project that you actually build, you could say to yourself, well, you know what? It was a series of steps that I had to do. But we're not looking back when we're engineering. We're looking forward. Looking back is easy because you know all of those things that you didn't know at the very beginning. Sometimes you're working on a simple thing that you've already done 100 times. You actually can know all of the steps. Okay, fine. Even then, though, you're wrong. You know why you're wrong? Because you might know how to build a registration form because you've built 19,000 registration forms in your career. But you don't know that on day 2 of building this registration form, you're going to get a brand new requirement from marketing, for instance, that completely invalidates your idea of the registration form because turns out now you're going to have to collect a cell phone number during registration because they want to try out sending out text messages for some kind of promotion they're going to do next week. See, even when you know, you don't know. Now, Agile makes an attempt to say, okay, we're going to bite off these little bits and then we're going to reassess at the end of a prescribed period of time. And it sounds great. It sounds like you should be able to account for those types of changes. But in real life, here's what actually happens. People sit there and they have a plan for all of the individual steps that they're going to put in sequence. And then they give lip service to the idea of sprints. So what I mean by that is they're not actually doing Agile. They're not actually refusing to look past the current sprint. That will require a level of discipline that most people managing developers, whether they be themselves developers or not, doesn't really matter. Those people usually don't have that level of discipline, because that's like discipline to say, you know what? I don't know when this is going to be finished, right? To actually say, I don't know. That's the thing that nobody wants to hear. And frankly, nobody wants to say, but it's also almost always the reality. Here's what I mean by this. Let's say in my example, we're going to make a new registration form for some system, okay? And we're going to capture first name, last name, email address, and then a password that we're going to confirm, okay? We say, all right, it's going to take about 3 weeks. So that's about a sprint of 2 weeks and another half of one to get it out the door. Fine. In this hypothetical example, you're halfway through. So you're through your first sprint, and now, boom, marketing needs you to collect cell phone number so that way you can send out text messages. And then the next sprint that was set up for us before that first sprint was over was supposed to be sending out a validation or a verification email. Now, suddenly, we've got this text message thrown into the mix. So all of the planning that was done for the subsequent sprint, this is where I'm going to get into where Agile breaks down, is now worthless, right? Because before we were doing email verification. Now the 2 weeks have passed, the first 2 weeks, and I have the majority of this form built, but the requirements have shifted under our feet over the course of those 2 weeks. So now all of the work that was gone into planning this upcoming sprint is irrelevant, because we don't care if we are validating with your email address anymore, because suddenly we want to validate your text message, your phone number. Great. So what do? Well, if we're really into the ideology of Agile and Scrum, what we're going to do is we're going to complete the sprint that we just planned, and then we're going to have another sprint on top of that afterwards where we do the text message stuff. But what happens when I need those text message verifications? I need these I need these phone numbers in the application this coming week or sometime during this sprint. The process has just broken down. Where we were going to start, or we didn't have a registration form. At the end, we were going to have a registration form. But in the middle of the process, the requirements changed, and now we have to build this text messaging feature into the registration form. So if we are going to adhere to the Agile methodology, we are going to complete the first sprint, which we already did, and then do the next sprint that we've planned, and then plan to do the new requirements in the subsequent sprint. Now, what happens is a process, if each one of these sprints is 2 weeks, a process that was supposed to take about 3 weeks, maybe 4, is now looking at 6 weeks. What does this actually mean? So during the first sprint, whoever's in charge of planning your software architecture, which often is your senior most developers, right, who are your most efficient usually, they spend time preparing for the next sprint. So you're planning the next things you're going to do while you're doing the current things. And that's, not necessarily a terrible idea, but they do it on this repeating schedule. So during that first sprint, we were planning out, let's say me and another lead dev, we were planning out how we're going to do the email verification. Meanwhile, requirements were about to shift under our feet. So that way all of our planning, which we've done that carries us into the next 2 weeks, is now worthless, and we have to go plan during that next phase of work for doing the work in the subsequent 2 weeks. Guess what's going to happen during the next sprint, during that second sprint, weeks 3 and 4? I'll bet you the requirements change one more time. So when you do this over and over and over again, you basically end up where your planning is never as good as you want it to be. So I know what people who are adherents to the Agile methodology and they're really true believers will say, well, you should have had those requirements up front. GRIMM RANT! Sure, I should have. But guess what? No matter how hard we try, we will fail. We will fail to have the requirements up front. Not every time, even when everyone has signed off and said these are accurate. God, so many times, the requirements turn out to just not be right. So when you're putting yourself in a situation where you're sticking to a strict schedule of how you're going to develop things and how you're going to plan things and when you're going to plan them, you often end up planning things that become worthless and wasting time finishing things that you don't even need to do. So if you're looking at getting into some kind of development methodology, I do not recommend Scrum-based or Agile. It's kind of done. I think the reality is that software development, software engineering, the whole process, right? The life cycle from idea to thing, I think it's actually still really complicated. And there's no one size fits all way to just build things. There's actually no way to remove the anxiety that comes with the unknown unknowns. You're never going to get to be happy with it. You're always going to have to be struggling against how many unknown unknowns there are, even when you've been doing this for almost 2 decades like me. The thing that I've learned over and over and over again is that despite efforts to try and standardize like a methodology and be sane and sleep well at night, you don't get that. That's a luxury that does not come with building software. It doesn't. You have to learn to be comfortable knowing that you're walking around in a dark room and you don't know what's around that corner over there. You don't know if there's a shark around the corner, which doesn't make sense because it's sharks and it's corners. But that's what it is. You're in a dark room and there could be a shark waiting for you. And that shark might be a great idea for marketing. Agile, Scrum, it's a great idea, and it's aimed at a noble cause, which is creating predictability and sanity for engineering teams. But real life always finds a way to break your nice, structured life. It's not going to happen. Just give up now. That's the grim reality.